Guys, welcome back to week 2 of our marriage series that we're doing. Last week was week 1, and we told everybody that to join us back today, and we were going to dive into week 2. So week 1 was God's design for marriage and what it's supposed to be, and then we said this week we're going to be diving into the reality of when the enemy attacks, and so that's where we're jumping in today.
Yep, that's right. Last week we talked a lot about how God designs something. And one thing you'll find is that whatever God designs, there's oftentimes a counterfeit or a move to destroy it. And I think we see that early on in Scripture with Adam and Eve. There is a clear design for marriage, but there's also that attack. So the episode today is designed to help call out some of those attacks, and then to really say, how do we get the enemy out of our marriage and out of our home?
Actually shared with a group of people just recently that I find it very, I don't know that interesting is the right word, but the enemy has not changed his attack mode since the beginning at all. He started in the garden, and he's been doing the same thing since day one. Like he's never had to change his tactics. We've always failed for the same thing, and he's gotten really good at his job. Has always been really good at his job, and we see that when you look at the statistics of marriage, 1 and 2 marriages and a divorce in or outside of the church. And so 50% of marriages across the board, no matter what you believe, no matter what happens in a divorce, and we all know that in the realm of law enforcement, those numbers are even higher.
Yep.
Well, as we're just starting out this episode, I think as we were discussing earlier, one of the things that we really wanted to point out early on is so crucial as we think about this is recognizing when things go kind of off the rails, when there's an issue that pops up in our marriages. It is so important to recognize that our spouse is not our enemy. The Bible's clear on that. Our battle's not against flesh and blood. There is an enemy who is seeking to disrupt, to tear apart, to destroy, and that's true for our marriages as well. And so, right from the onset of this episode, we want to be clear to kind of drive that home and let that sink in and hold on to that. It's really difficult when things are bad, when things have heated up, when you are having that disagreement. It's real easy to kind of go to that place of, she's out to hurt me. She's trying to destroy us, or he always does this. He is trying to tear us apart. He is my enemy. And that's just not the case.
Correct. I think that's so hard for, everybody, honestly. When you get really upset, when you get hurt, when you've been wronged, the easiest thing to do is put a name attached to it, and you attack that person and that name. And oftentimes what I have to remind myself and remind others is, so if my problem is with my wife, Courtney, and I put all the onus on her, and she absolutely is wrong, done away with her, next. Well, now Courtney 2.0, whatever her name is, will do very similar things. And then I get rid of her, and then Courtney 3.0. And the problem is that there's a root cause to all of it, and we have to really dive into that. Scripture is very clear that we need to realize before we even get into combat that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. In Ephesians, actually, the famous passage, and this is the shield armory, and so we often talk about this passage in Ephesians, and it's Ephesians chapter 6, and it talks about the full armor of God. But before we put on the full armor of God, the first step that we have to do is we have to realize we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So when I'm meeting with couples and in my own marriage, I have to make sure that we've accomplished that step, that I'm not fighting against the other person. What we're doing today is one or both people have allowed the enemy to enter into your home and into your relationship. And what we have to do is figure out today and get a game plan to get him out. But we do not fight against each other. That's why in marriage counseling, they often will have the couples hold hands when they're discussing really difficult things. You guys ever heard of that?
Oh, I've done it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done it. And it's amazing how, if a couple comes in, I've had couples come in that were pretty, they were seats apart. And if looks could kill, there would have been it would have been a mess in the office. I mean, and by the end of that session, I had them sit side by side, and then they actually held hands, and it's a little bit harder to be quite as amped up and upset when you're side by side and holding hands. Now, I guess we also need to point out that one of the other spouse has blown it in some way. And sometimes when the enemy is allowed in, sometimes one spouse can really significantly hurt the other. And so we're not trying to minimize that or excuse wrong behavior, right?
No, there's accountability. You did that action. We can't just put it all on the enemy. I allowed the enemy in my life, and I hurt, and I did the wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody's got to just let's just wrap up in what both of you guys just said. Is somebody's got to take ownership of that. Somebody's got to be willing to step up and say, "I messed up." It's kind of like I think last week's episode we talked just a tiny bit about the love and respect thing. And we talked about the crazy cycle. Somebody at some point has to own up and say, I got to get us off of this. We can't keep going down this way. We can't stay on this cycle because we're doing nothing but hurting each other. We're putting our marriage in a bad place. So somebody's got to step up and say, okay, we've blown it, but now I need to own the fact that I've messed it up, and I need to move on. And so I think, too, one thing we need to say, and one of the things that we talked about leading up to today's episode is being the fact that we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, and the real enemy is not our spouse. The real enemy is the enemy who's entered, like you said, Gareth, into our marriage and caused the struggle, but we've allowed to be there. Recognizing that fact does not give us the ability to have an excuse to be difficult with our husband or our wife. Well, that was just the enemy that caused that. Well, no, you made a decision to allow that to happen. You still made a choice to do something to cause strife or discontent or hurt or pain or whatever it is in your marriage. Yeah. Yes, and maybe the enemy was behind that because that's what he wants. But at the end of the day, you still allowed it. And again, that comes back to accepting accountability and ownership for where they messed up. So I'll give you an example of that. There is somebody within our family, and they have been married I think it's 5 times. I know for sure 4, but I think they got married a 5th time. And this person always said every time their marriage ended, they always blamed everything on the other spouse every single time. Mm. Now, I don't disregard that there were probably some issues there with that spouse because look, none of us are perfect, right? None of us around this table are perfect. Our spouses aren't perfect. A perfect person in this world just doesn't exist. Not like we would sit across the table from. There's only one perfect person that's ever been, and we are not that person.
Yeah,
No. But one thing that she never wants to do is she never wants to accept responsibility for her actions that help lead to those marriages ending. And it's always the other person's fault. Now, like you said, one person can make detrimental decisions that cause a marriage to implode or to have significant challenges or to even end. But at the end of the day, we even talked about this preparing for these 2 episodes. Like anytime we've met with couples, marriage counseling, premarital counseling, whatever, when we find out that there are issues that we are having to dig through and deal with, even if there's one primary issue at hand, there are still issues on both sides of the table with both people. It never, very rarely, or next to never, does it exist that there aren't issues on both sides of the table. Yeah. But again, we've got to be willing to accept accountability and be able to take ownership for what's ours.
If we're gonna ever get past it, you have to take ownership of it. And I think that also deflates the problem just a little bit. When you accept accountability, you're identifying that I had a strong contributing factor to where we're at today. And so by taking ownership of that, then I now can begin to work on it. I think of working with people and watching them interact with conflict. And you'll see very quickly when you have somebody that has had to avoid and dodge accountability most of their life, they have an opportunity to say, you're right, I see that, I need to get better. Very simple. We could be done, but they will do everything in their power not to be accountable. And I see that oftentimes in relationships.
So just trying to move this along a little bit, what are some of the primary things, or what are some of the things that we see on a regular basis that pop up to kind of get us off rails in the marriage relationship?
So I think the enemy will use, and then we will start to fill in the blank, the enemy will use, number one, a lack of communication. And so I don't know the percentage. It would be extremely high if I could sit down with anybody that I've ever met with in my office or counseled with or been to our house. Communication is the heart and core of everything. You communicate when you're happy. You communicate when you're upset. You should communicate when you need boundaries, when you need space, when you need closeness. And if you don't have that communication, then you really don't have the framework to be able to navigate those problems.
Yeah, so I really think that's probably one of the key things we deal with, right? When we talk with couples is that they aren't communicating, or maybe they're not speaking each other's language. A husband thinking he can communicate to his wife the way he would expect to be communicated to, and she's supposed to understand, or vice versa. We are, men and women are very different, right?
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
We communicate. Well, what is it, the saying that men tend to communicate to report, and women tend to communicate for rapport. So if we think about even just that, how that can create issues, if a wife has the expectation that, when the husband walks through the door, or maybe she's just walking through the door from work, and wants to have a conversation, it's like, hey, tell me about your day, and he's like, had a good day.
And what she heard was what?
I'm really not interested in talking. Like I
don't want to communicate with her.
Yeah. And he summarized his day. Yeah, I went to work. It was a pretty good day, and here I am.
Yeah.
But she wants to hear the story behind the story.
Right.
And even just little things like that, understanding that we tend to think differently. We have different missions with our communication as men and women in general terms. Again, that's a kind of a rule of thumb type thing, but we have a different purpose in communicating. So we do communicate differently. And if we don't understand that alone can create tension.
Sure.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
It's kind of related to it, but another way the enemy will step into a marriage or have a stronghold is it with different personalities, or the fact versus feeling. I feel a certain way is much different than this is what happened. And so there are people in marriages, and this can go two ways. We would say typically women are more feelings oriented and men are more facts oriented. That always isn't the case. I can think of a couple couples right now where the wife is very black and white, very facts oriented, and the husband is a little more feelings oriented. And so just figuring that out. But as you communicate, oftentimes people will communicate their feelings, and that is not what actually happened at the instance. So if you get both of those people in the same room, they may not agree on that. So to be able to communicate and go, I hear what you're saying, and it sounds like you felt like blank. That's a big deal. The other thing is I've seen with that is personalities. You hear opposites attract, and I would say that is 100% true. And it's a beautiful thing if you don't kill each other. Opposites attract because it's a strength. My wife is 100% different than me in every single area, in personality, in conflict, in anything. She's polar opposite. And is that a good thing? Yeah, because it balances out my stuff. And it helps us. There are people and things that I can do that she could never do, and vice versa. So if we work as a team, now we're a really sharp team because we got both ends covered. So just a simple example would be introverts versus extroverts. An introvert is somebody who recharges just by themselves. An extrovert is somebody who recharges in large groups. One way the enemy will step into a marriage is when you have an introvert marry an extrovert. And they're both trying to recharge, which is a normal, natural thing. And the introvert's like, I want to go home, get in a hot bath, read a book. The extrovert's like, let's invite half the block over for chicken wings. And like, well, we just work 60 hours. Let's do chicken wings. And because he wants to recharge or whatever, she wants to recharge. So I've seen that really be a big problem area in couples.
So I think there's another one that comes right off of what you're talking about. And I think one of the things is quality time, because especially the world that we're living in now, there's so much distraction. You take just the outside voices alone, but then you add this profession with the shifts and the long hours and the overtime and the getting called in and all of the things that go in with it, and then you add things like talking about when they're wanting to recharge, hobbies and things that fill them up and that kind of stuff. There's so many different things that begin to compete for the time of each other. So there are some things that compete from your time from a couple standpoint, but then there are things that compete for time from an individual standpoint within that couple. Well, then you add kids into the mix. Yeah. And then you're taking care of a child, and then they're growing up and they're playing sports, and you have multiple kids. And I can speak from that one right now because I've got a 14 or 15-year-old and an almost 12-year-old, and they're playing two different sports, and my wife is running one direction with one, and I'm running one direction with another. And we go nights sometimes where we literally see each other. We come home from work, she grabs one, I grab the other one, we go different directions, we come home, we make sure everybody's showered, and we go to bed, and we get up and do it all over again the next day. And there are times my wife has literally come in, I'm sitting at the dining room table, and she'll ask me to pull my chair back, and she'll sit down in my lap, and she'll look at me in the face, and she's like, I don't feel like I've seen you in forever. I mean, I know I've seen you because we've seen each other in passing, and we see each other in the morning when we get up, but I don't feel like I've spent any time with you because we're so busy that we don't have any time for each other.
In today's society, that's one of the things we have to be extremely intentional to spend time together as a couple. Yeah. It's true before we have children. It's certainly true after we have children, and it becomes, it is challenging. One of the things that I admire about the couples that I've seen do it well, and they have kids, and is when the parents have limited the activities that their children can be involved with. Some people have bought into the idea that their children can get involved with everything and do everything. It's all about, and that's just not healthy. It's not healthy for the kids. It's not healthy for us. It's not, as a couple, lovingly limit what your children are involved in. I'm not saying, I'm not saying sports are bad. I'm not saying band is bad and things like that. I'm just saying as parents, we need to exercise some good wisdom, use some good wisdom, and help our children to make choices. If we set them up for life thinking that they can do everything, it's just not realistic, and it's not good for them big picture. And it's setting our marriage up for trouble if we believe, even before we have kids, if we think we can work a full-time job and then work all the overtime we possibly can, and we're just going to be passing ships in the night with each other as a couple, we're really setting ourselves up to have problems and really setting ourselves up for failure ultimately. We have to make good, intentional decisions to spend time together, so that we're growing together in our marriage and not drifting apart.
My wife and I, by no means, I don't say this to sound like we figured it out, because we absolutely have not. We have made a lot of mistakes in the course of our marriage and parenting. And in fact, I would say right now is probably one of the hardest seasons we've ever had in being parents. But there's one thing that we agreed on from the very beginning, and maybe it was because of, I don't know if how much of it had to do with our raising or me being a youth pastor while we were married and not having kids and watching other parents raise their kids or whatever. But we did what you were talking about. We told our kids, outside of church, you get to do one thing per season. We're not doing two things. We're not doing three things. So you find something you really want to do. And for a while, we really had to let our kids kind of experiment because they didn't know what they wanted to do.
Sure.
And so we would let them experiment. So we would try one thing in the fall. If that didn't work, we tried something in the spring, or whatever. And so finally, after, kind of some trial and error, my oldest found out that cheerleading was her thing. And so she does cheerleading year round. That's her thing. She, we do it in the fall with football season. We do it in the winter with basketball. They even do a couple of wrestling matches throughout the year. Spring, they have conditioning and tryouts. And then summer, they do practices. And so it's kind of a year-round thing. And then my littlest one, she has found out that she has a love for softball. And so we do softball in the spring, and we do training throughout the rest of the year. Usually like one night a week, we'll go and do some private training, and she loves softball. And so, but again, and she's now actually told us that she wants to play volleyball this coming fall. And so that'll give her a sport to play in the fall. But again, that'll be her thing that she does. And so that has been really helpful for us, and it's given us an opportunity with other couples that we know that are struggling. I will say this: my wife and I had some friends who came to us. We were both of their daughters' youth pastor. They had 2 kids, and they came to us. We used to tell them, man, like they were on all the travel teams. They were gone 3/4 of the weekends out of the year, and so they weren't plugged into church a lot of times. But we were really close with them, and we used to tell them, say, hey, look, this is setting just a dangerous example for your kids, and it might come back to be harmful in the future. And just a few years ago, that same couple came to me and my wife and just said, where did we go wrong? Because now our kids are not in the church. They have zero interest in a walk with the Lord. One has kids now, and obviously they want that for their grandkid. Their grandkid be raised and around Jesus and around his church, and they just looked at us and said, where did we go wrong? Where did we mess up? And I said, look, you guys are great parents. Like, you loved your kids. They were very involved, but I don't know if you remember when they were traveling 3/4 of the weekends out of the year with travel sports. And we said, this is setting a dangerous precedent for the future with them feeling like they don't need to be part of that. And now what they're seeing is they're reaping that sowing from when they were younger, and their hearts are broken over it. Right. And we're trying to help walk them through that. And, but it just goes to show why it's so important to just let our kids focus in on something, but at the same token, limiting how much they're trying. Because if they're trying to do a lot, they can't do anything great. It's one of those things like you master, jack of all trades, master of none type of thing.
Yeah. It brings up a kind of an interesting point, kind of what I hear you saying with sports and many other things. You have to do it with intentionality. And
Correct.
So with everything in our relationship, there has to be an intention behind it, or we won't hit a level of success. We'll look back and we'll have regrets on that. With relationships, and specifically marriages, one of the things that oftentimes that we have to navigate is conflict and bad problems. What I tell every couple before I marry them is, if I could give you one gift, if I just had a magic wand and I could give you anything in the world, what would you want? And the husband's like, I'd like a truck. I'm like, I'm with you, buddy. Wife's like, man, I would love and she dream up something like an endless wardrobe, or a whatever, cool closet, or a pantry that looks like this, or whatever her dream is. And what I often tell them is, from my seat, if I could give you anything, it would be a toolbox on how to handle problems. Because the one thing I will guarantee is you may not ever have a truck in your marriage, and that's a hard thing to handle. You may not ever have the pantry or the closet or the whatever of your dreams. But what I can guarantee is you will hit a problem. You'll hit a roadblock. You'll hit a disagreement. You'll hit something you'll have to overcome. And so one of the ways I see the enemy slide into marriages is when we begin to hit conflicts that are normal, that are reasonable, that we're supposed to be able to overcome, but we end up fighting each other and we end up hurting each other. One of the things about marriage that is so hard is that we know the buttons to push that hurt our spouse the most.
Absolutely. And the longer we're together, the bigger the arsenal.
Yeah.
And so we have to make a conscious choice. We really have to think through the big picture. What are we trying to accomplish here? Do I want to just continue to be at odds and let this thing blow up bigger? Or do I really genuinely want a relationship to be healthy and to be in a better place so there's peace in my home? And if so, how I try to tackle that issue is going to look very different.
So it goes back to what we said at the very beginning about the foundation of all this is that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So if I have a disagreement in my house and I know the button to push to hurt and wound my spouse, why would I do that? Yeah. I'm not fighting her. If I was fighting her, I would hit that button. I would 100% do that. Get her to stop, go on. But I need her to help me to get the enemy out of this relationship. And so we have to be careful of those no-go zones. And oftentimes I hear couples, and that is where damage and scars come from, is when couples enter into this area in conflict where they begin wounding each other.
There's another book that, we sometimes throw out some different resources, and one of these books that I would recommend, it's called The Good Fight. It's by a husband and wife team, actually, Les and Leslie Parrott. I don't know how two Leslies found each other, but they did. A husband and wife team, Les and Leslie Parrott, and it's called The Good Fight. And they talk about getting to the core of a good fight, and they define a good fight as one where you both win. You're fighting for a win-win. It doesn't do us any good if one or the other wins, because we both lose in that scenario. If my wife and I end up in an argument and I manage to yell louder and my wife leaves the room in tears, I don't get to throw up my hands and throw up my arms and say, yes, I won. I mean, what did I win? My wife is now hurt all the more. She left the room. She's probably not going to be so apt to have a conversation with me anytime soon again, because nobody wants to be yelled at, right? And that can go both ways. It doesn't do any good for a woman to raise her voice and yell at the husband only for him to go in and give her the silent treatment. Again, it's that crazy cycle business again. So at some point, let's move ahead. If we have a couple that maybe they're struggling with that communication and how to do that better. And maybe there's something that's kind of been brewing under the surface a bit, and it's reared its ugly head here and there. How do we help this couple address that and work towards a win-win?
Sure. One of the things that I think is extremely helpful is it's got to start with permission. So, for instance, if I have a problem with somebody, I need permission to open that door and begin to have that discussion. For instance, if I have a problem with my spouse and I open up the door from work and go, we got to talk right now. What is that doing? That's forcing them in the corner, and automatically they're defensive.
Yep.
So when we interact and we realize the enemy's gotten in our relationship, that it's tense, hey, I'm feeling kind of tense, and I know you're probably feeling the same thing. Is this a good time to talk about that? And the other person may say, like, no, I have 10,000 things to do right now. That would not be helpful to me. Could we do that tonight? Absolutely. And you have to respect that boundary. Another thing is and this is a very helpful tool to try to figure out how to work through the conflict is, and I know we all do this in premarital counseling, but we have to figure out our spouse's conflict style. There's a personality style, extrovert versus introvert, but did you know there's a conflict style? There's people that actually have different styles of conflict that they prefer and default to. So I didn't know this, but when I got married, I went through premarital counseling, and during that, I found out that I have a competitive conflict style. Which means
I would have never picked up that. Not at all.
No.
Yeah.
News to me.
Sarcasm here.
Which is probably not the best tool for communication, by the way.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. But I didn't know this. It made perfect sense to me. And again, you guys are laughing about it, but anytime there was a conflict, I would think that I would have to win. And so if somebody beat me in that, I would go, okay, I guess I messed up. But if you couldn't beat me, I would just think, I guess you're weak and wrong, and I would go on with life. There's a lot of negatives in that. One of the many negatives is if you marry a wife who is accommodating. So my wife will go, hey, I think this is wrong. I will respond with, no, I don't think it's wrong because of A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, whatever, and go through it. And she will say, I'm not fighting over it. I know that I'm right, and she will accommodate. So there's been no learning on my part, and there's been no learning on her part because we both were opposite of that. We have to come to the center of it. So if there's a conflict in our relationship, in our home, with my conflict style, I want to deal with it right now. Let's be done with it. You got to know the conflict style of your spouse. They may say, if I deal with it right now, I don't know that I'm going to be appropriate. Can you give me a day to be able to chill a little bit?
Yeah.
Is that reasonable?
It's absolutely reasonable. The only thing, you have to follow through on that.
Yeah.
You can't keep kicking the can and never get to it.
Can't avoid.
You can't avoid it, but it's certainly appropriate. And if you're really going for a win-win, the one who normally would like to have that, Gareth wants to have that conversation right now. Well, that person's just going to have to say, you know what? It's more important to me that we truly move forward and have a win-win here. So yeah, it's absolutely fine for us to meet tomorrow evening. Let's do that.
That's the story of life in my house, because I'm a lot like you. When conflict happens, we can just sit down and talk it out right then. I'm going to be fine. I might not like it. I might not like the end result of it, but I'm ready to move on at that point. Mm-hmm. My wife, on the other hand, if it's some decent conflict, she's like, I need some time to process it, because that way I can say the right thing. Because right now I'm just in a place upstairs in my head that I can't say things the way they should be said. And sometimes, like, especially if it's something that is a push button issue for her or something that makes her upset, like, she's like, I'm going to say something that's going to be hurtful, and I'd rather not do that. So she'll sometimes for her, she has to go get in her car and go out for a drive. That just calms her down, like, and gets her to a place. She's like, okay, now I'm ready to sit down and have a conversation, but she has to process it through and think through it before if she tries to sit down and have that discussion right then and there, that's hard for her. Yeah. And so over the years, I've had to learn to be okay with that. That was hard for me in the beginning. I had to learn that even though I was ready to talk about it right then and there, she wasn't. But if I would just wait, those conversations go way better if I just hang tight, because she was really good about what you said, Darren. She was really good about the follow through. It was just, I just needed to give her a little bit of time to process it before she could do that. Mm-hmm.
Well, in my early years of marriage, I've seen this in other couples, and I can recognize it pretty quickly because we weren't the best at this early on. I could give all kinds of arguments for why I was right. I was always right. Because I could give great arguments. I could, because I'm ahead. I can give you the whole list of why I'm right, and my wife would be like, okay, she would go along with it, and so I thought, okay, life is good. Mm-hmm. And then, but it wasn't. But with time, I realized, you know what, my wife was just agreeing to avoid the conflict, and I don't want that. I want my wife to thrive. And so, you know, I realized that I needed to dial that back and make sure that my wife has that voice, and because she is important to me, and how she views things, how she feels about things, it matters to me. And so at some point, if you're in that relationship and you are that person who, you know, you would probably be good in the courtroom if you were trying to go after somebody. What tactics that work in a courtroom may not be the best for a marriage.
Well, and the heart of it too is you're not fighting each other.
Yep.
Like you're not opposed to each other.
Two have become one.
So fight together to fix whatever's broken.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so
if I'm attacking my wife, I'm attacking us. We're attacking the marriage. So there's no benefit to that. Mm-hmm. The only benefit is if we together work towards a resolution, a solution moving forward.
So looking back, kind of the first step, if you were listening and you're like, my marriage, my relationship, there is a problem there. First step again would be identifying that, bringing that up, and doing that with permission. Oftentimes we need to avoid language that is accusatory or inflammatory or something that's abrasive. Hey, I'm noticing that there is a significant problem, and I'm sure that I have been a contributing factor to that. Would this be a good time to discuss that? That's permission. When you get into that conversation, one thing that we need to be very, very careful of is avoiding language like "you always."
Yeah, the extreme language of never, always, those kind of things that are extreme, which and it feels like that when in the moment it feels like that the person always is doing something or never does. It's probably not the case, and on the receiving end of that, we always have to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person. It's like, how is that going to be received if I'm drawing some, you know, speaking in extreme language like that, verbiage.
Yep. The other thing after that is when something is brought to the surface, an appropriate apology goes a long way. Yep. Now there has to be actions to that. You can't just keep saying sorry for something. But I read a really cool book called Peacemakers, and it's on how basically to apologize. And I've noticed that we really struggle in this line of work to apologize. And I found out that it's because most of our departments have a policy that while you're at work, you are not allowed to apologize to people as an admission of guilt. Did you know that? You can't do that. So now you take that reasonable policy that saves us from civil and criminal liability in the courtroom to now we put that in our marriage. And we are like, well, I hear you. Like, no. What you need to say is, I'm sorry. But it's almost physically impossible to get that out. A heartfelt apology goes a long way. Yeah. A good apology looks like this. When there's been a wrong that's been brought up, that is truly something that I have done, repeating what has happened. So if I have been very abrasive to my wife and I made her feel very unloved, she brings this up to me. She said, hey, is this a good time to talk about it? Absolutely. She doesn't use inflammatory language. Here's what happened. Here's what I felt. My apology goes much like this. So what I heard you say was, I acted this way. So that we're tracking. She communicates that back to me. Yes, that is correct. Well, I am sorry for doing that. It was not my intent to make you feel that way. That is what happened, and that I did wound you, and I am sorry for that. Going forward, I will work very hard not to do that again. So I've taken accountability, I've repeated it, and I've also said, this is my plan to correct that. The other thing is when we apologize, this is just a side note. I do this with my kids now, but I think I've brought this up on the podcast before. But when you apologize and someone says, Darren, I'm sorry, you would say what?
I forgive you.
Okay. That's correct, right? Most of the time people say, it's okay. Well, Darren, I'm sorry I punched you in the face.
That was a poor choice.
Yeah. Well, it's okay,
and it wasn't right for you to do that. I do forgive you, but you're not getting paid this week.
Oh, boy. See, actions have consequences.
Absolutely.
So part of the apology is, again, accountability, but we need to say, I forgive you. That releases that person of that.
What you described and talking about the apology in that book, the Getting to the Core of a Good Fight, the good fight. They talk about in there about only apologize when you genuinely mean it. All right. We see that you brought up kids, see that all the time. You need to apologize to your brother. Like, sorry. Oh, well, that sounds very genuine. You know, right? I mean, how many times have you seen that played out with your kids? It's the same for us. We need to apologize when we can be authentic and genuine about it. And they bring up they summarized it, what you just described, they summarized it with the 3 R's: responsibility, regret, and remedy.
Mm-hmm.
Responsibility, you're taking responsibility for the wrong that was done. You're expressing your regret, and then you're coming up with a mutually agreed upon remedy, really. Now you can suggest some things, but the one that's been hurt probably ought to have a little bit of a say in that as well. Would it be helpful in the future if I handled things like this, and allow the other person to kind of hear that, maybe give some shape to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually have been working on this very process with my 11-year-old. She asks me all the time, she'll say sorry, and I was like, you keep telling me sorry, but you're not changing your behavior. She's like, you say that to me all the time. And I'm like, well, there's a reason that I say it at the rate that I say it. It's because we keep going through the same thing over and over again. Sorry is not very good if there's no behavior change. And when you say it, you don't really mean it. You're just like, sorry, Dad. And I'm like, you're not sorry. For one, that you obviously don't mean it. And two, we keep going through the same repetitive cycle. But we do this as adults. It's not just kids that do this. And that's what we're talking about here. You've got to be able to have that sincerity and have that change and then move forward from there.
Can we also hit on just some very practical things as far as when we have this conversation? Okay, we've already established it needs to be on an agreed upon time. It may not be immediately. It might be that next day after one of the others had a chance to kind of process a little bit, catch their breath, and before coming into that. But it's mutually agreed upon time. And just practically speaking, like, do this in a place and at a time where you can really minimize the distractions. All right, we're probably not trying to have this conversation while there's a ball game on the TV. We're probably not needing to do this, when we have a house full of company. Just be aware of what possible distractions there could be, and minimize those. We all have emergencies that come up, and goodness knows if you have children, you try to have a conversation with your spouse, and that'll be a time that little Johnny falls out of the tree and breaks his arm. That those things happen, but let's try to minimize and eliminate the distractions that we can.
As you were talking about that, one thing that we maybe just to hit as a small point, when you guys are navigating the stresses and conflicts of marriage, that needs to be a private thing.
Yeah.
So I have fallen into this. I've seen people fall into it, and I don't know that it ever works out well, is when you have a public disagreement. something that's significant, and you do that publicly, now you've invited everybody that's in that room to be in something that's sacred called your relationship, and it's not theirs to have.
It's probably not time to call mom in and, call,
We're
bringing other family members, in-laws, and that kind of thing into that mix may not be the best move, right?
No.
And I would also say, like, don't do this in front of your kids. This is not their burden to carry. They don't understand the depth of the level to whatever it is you're discussing or going through, nor should they, because they're kids. And they're not, and they need stability from mom and dad. And so when we have these conversations in front of them, it creates a level of instability maybe that we don't even recognize in them.
And we understand that it might be perfectly appropriate for you to, if you're having a slight disagreement on, hey, where are we going to eat tonight? Okay, that's fine to have a little disagreement over that in front of your kids. So you need to teach your kids how to problem solve and negotiate and that kind of thing. We're not talking about those smaller everyday kind of things. Those are appropriate conversations to have in front of kids. But when we're talking about those bigger, really hurtful personal things that, those are not the conversations we need to have. Oh, well, he's just watching some videos, 10 feet away from us while we're having this conversation. I promise you that kid's hearing everything that you're saying, and they don't give a rip about what's on the screen when their parents are, having this major conversation. So that's a very good point to bring up. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I think a lot of this goes back. I should say recently, a long time ago, I had someone who I feel is a very wise person say to me, I think a lot of this, Garrett, you used the term earlier in this episode, intentionality. And I think a lot of this comes down to that, because this is what they said to me. They said, when you're dating somebody, you spend a lot of time, going after that person, learning that person, studying that person. And then you get engaged to that person, and then things just, they just get more intense at that point, because like, man, you're headed towards marrying this person. They're going to become your spouse. And then you marry them in the first couple of years, or what they call those honeymoon years, and then everything is just kind of wide open. It's in like this crazy, just wide open season. But then what happens is, as time moves on, life takes over, jobs take over, kids take over, all the things we allow to take over in those places. What it begins to do is it begins to remove the intentionality out of our relationship. Mm. And that's a lot of times when we start seeing these things happen. In fact, I just recently read that they stated that the average marriage now lasts at the what we're seeing now, we're looking at about 9 years until the divorce factor is hitting now. So about year 9 is when they're starting to see that's kind of becoming the common factor number right now for divorces in marriage. And one of the things that they actually talked about in that article was they start about year 5, they start seeing levels of couples dating, intentionally spending time, communication, all of these things start to, instead of they had gone up year 1 to year 5, they starting to plateau. And then at year 6, they start coming downhill. And then by year 9, a couple of years of that, they've just reached a bottom out place where then they wind up in divorce, and they decide to quit instead of fighting for their marriage, because by that point, they've done what I've told couples when it comes to marriage counseling. They forgot who they fell in love with. They forgot what they fell in love with about that person. They forgot about what it was about that person that they pursued in those earlier years. They forgot the things that made their relationship strong and work well in those earlier years. And so, again, I think a lot of it comes down to complacency, no intentionality, no more striving in the area that's the most important, because we give in every other area, and then we don't feel like we have anything else left to give, and the most important thing that we have in our life begins to suffer.
And I will say, too, one of the things that I've told couples for years, and certainly, I believe this to be true. My wife and I have always felt like the best possible gift we could we could give to our children outside of, and of course, faith is very important to us. We wanted to share our faith and make it easy for them to come to faith in Jesus Christ. But outside of that, the best possible gift that we could give our children is to model before them what a healthy marriage is. And I will say that one of the things that my wife and I have seen through the years is a lot of couples, once they have children, everything became circled around the children, centered around the children. And I'm going to tell you, and you may not want to hear this, but that's not the way to do marriage. It's not the way to do family.
So true, man.
You're going to be amazed at how quickly those years pass by. And if you, first of all, if you make the children the center of the family, things get off kilter. And too often kids grow up thinking that the world owes them something because everything's revolved around them their whole lives. And you've just set them up for failure or created monsters that nobody wants to work around because they're self-centered. It's because we've nurtured that. But if we will make our marriage, if our marriage takes priority over our little Johnny, little Susie, it's the overflow of what God is doing in my marriage that I can pour into my children. And it works that way. I've lived it. I've seen it. I'm reaping the benefits of that now. And so are my daughters and their husbands. And it's not because we did it perfectly, but if we're intentional about focusing on the marriage first, the children will get everything that they need. I just wanted to mention that. One of the other things too, my wife is always, there's a verse that it's always been very important to her. And it also is from Ephesians. There's so much in that one letter there, but it talks about in your anger, not sinning, and then do not let the sun go down on your anger. That's really important. And so if you are able to resolve those issues before you go to sleep, before you go to bed, fantastic. But let's say you've had an issue come up and the one, your spouse says, I'm not prepared to discuss this tonight. Can we do it? Can we have this conversation tomorrow? Okay, you agree upon that. But still, before you go to bed, just kind of reiterate that thought that we mentioned earlier that, hey, I know we're not where we want to be on that issue, but I want you to know that I still love you and value you, and we're going to work through this. Something along those lines before you go to bed. There's just something healthy about that. And it's been really important throughout our marriage, and I would ask you to consider that as well.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's nearly impossible for us to hit every single thing on one of these episodes, but I think I hope for the people listening, I hope they have realized that we've tried to, in our best ability, just kind of take a 50,000 foot view with these things and hit some of the most important things, and also kind of lay a groundwork for what do we do when the enemy attacks? That was kind of our goal. And so we hope for today for you that maybe, again, we kind of said this last week at the end of that episode, maybe things are going well right now and we're glad, but there will come a point that the enemy will attack. And maybe right now things aren't so well, and maybe the enemy is attacking. And we hope wherever you find yourself that at some point or either now, that some of these things will help you begin to get off of that crazy cycle and get out of that struggle that you're facing. We realize it's not easy. That a lot of times it's not just one conversation, or it's not just one day of fixing it. Like you're talking, when you talk about putting in work in a marriage, it can be days, weeks, months, years of fixing things. But one thing that we, especially the three of us around this table, believe in is that a marriage is worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
It is not going to be easy when you take two people and come together that are different. It's going to have hard days, but the goal is that on the hard days that you have committed, and as Gareth, as you talked about in the last episode, you have made a covenant with that person, and that you are going to fight for that covenant and do whatever is necessary to come out on the other side of this thing.
And please hear us when we say this. Do not be afraid to reach out for help.
Yep.
Sometimes things can get heated to the point, or maybe it's not so heated. Maybe it's just like we don't know where to start. Call us up, please. We would love, and we do this frequently. We would love to sit down with the two of you and kind of help navigate that a little bit. And if we're not the right fit, if we're not the right answer, well, there's other people we can refer you to. But the point is just what Adam said. Marriage is worth fighting for. The benefits of a healthy marriage are just incredible, and the stability that provides for a home and a family, and for you as a couple, is just incredible. So don't give up. Don't throw in the towel. And do not be afraid to reach out to get help. If I have trouble with my transmission, well, let's face it. If I have trouble with most anything with a car, I'm taking it to a mechanic because I am not good with that. But certainly, if I'm having trouble with a transmission, I'm taking my car into somebody who knows what they're doing, because it's worth, in most cases, right? The vast majority of it, I'd much rather do a repair to my car and keep it going than to try to figure out how to get something else. And with marriage, how much more important is a marriage than a car? It just makes sense. If I'm having an issue, let's go to somebody who can maybe help us navigate this if we're having trouble doing it on our own.
Yeah. Well, guys, this has been a great episode, and I've enjoyed this conversation with you all, even though we typically don't record these after we have lunch because we typically get a little sluggish. But today we made an exception to the rule when we recorded this one. I had enjoyed a pretty delicious cheeseburger for lunch right before we did this.
I did make a very conscious decision not to get dessert because I'm sure that would have sent me over the edge and I would have been sleeping. So
yeah, we're proud of you.
Thank you.
Good
thank
job.
you for the affirmation. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go get dessert.
All right. That sounds like a great plan to me. So
that escalated.
Sorry you guys can't join with us, but we're going to go have dessert. We'll catch you later.